what I'll present essentially is the paper, or parts of a paper I published last year in the journal Neuroethics, where I kind of take an extended mind perspective to people who have dementia, and particularly I look at Alzheimer's disease, and then kind of extrapolate what that would mean for people who have Alzheimer's disease and how we can maybe take an extended mind view to help Alzheimer's patients better remember their personal past by using technology. So that's kind of the goal or the angle that I'm taking. So here, brief outline of my talk. I'll start by briefly explaining what narrative identity is, or the narrative self, the idea that who I am is my remembered life story. I'll then move on to argue that the building blocks of the narrative, the specific autobiographical memories, can be scaffolded or extended, which means that they're not just in the brain, but are kind of extended or sometimes distributed across me as an embodied agents and artifacts in the environment. I'll then move on to say a few things about how dementia impacts our memory narrative identity and what it means for their well-being. And then I'll end this talk with giving a number of suggestions for how we can improve the memories and by extension the narrative identity of people who suffer from Alzheimer's disease. So that's on the program. So first, a couple of slides on what I think narrative identity is. Now, on one level of analysis, who we are as persons, as individuals, is characterized by our narrative, which is our remembered life story. So the way I remember my past. Note immediately here that I start this bullet point with the phrase on one level of analysis. So I don't think that narrative is the only thing that defines me or characterizes me. So I think my capacity for language, my capacity for consciousness, my specific embodiment, all these features are very important as well for who I am, what makes me me. But I'm going to focus in this talk on narrative identity. Well, narratives, these are important to have. It's a good thing that we all have narratives, I think, because they provide us a sense of continuity of self over time. Note that I use the word sense of continuity. I don't want to make the additional metaphysical claim that memory and narratives are the things that make us the same person over time. That's a kind of a separate debate in metaphysics that I don't really want to be drawn into, but it certainly feels as though I am the same person over time because of my memory. So phenomenologically, I think it feels as though I am the same person now as last year, 10 years, because of my narrative. All right, now here's an example of where things can go wrong if you have Alzheimer's, not Alzheimer's, sorry, when you have a specific kind of dementia, namely Korsakoff syndrome. So this is an example from a book of Oliver Sacks. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with Oliver Sacks, the late British-American neurologist who died, I think, a few years ago, or maybe last year even. He wrote a book called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. And one of the chapters in the book is about Mr. Thompson. So he's Korsakoff. So he was an alcoholic for most of his life. So Korsakoff is caused by alcoholism. And at the end of his life, when he was 50, 60 years old, he got a fever. And then that kind of accelerates the process. And he lost pretty much his entire autobiographical memory, right? He didn't have any narrative at all anymore. There was nothing there. If you want to ask him, who are you? What did you do in your past? Blank. He couldn't do anything. So what happens is this anecdote that Oliver Sacks gives is that, okay, Oliver Sacks comes in the room of Mr. Thompson. He's a neurologist. He wears a white coat. Mr. Thompson is confused. He's like, what is this man doing here? There's this man in my room with a white coat. Must be a butcher or could be a butcher. If there is a butcher, I'm a customer in a butcher shop. And Mr. Thompson starts making jokes about buying meat and stuff, right? It doesn't make any sense, but he has to do that because he needs these kind of micro narratives that he confabulates on the spot in order to make sense of situations. If you don't have any autobiographical memory at all, it's very difficult to kind of successfully get around in the world. You kind of need it to have proper agency and things. If you don't have autobiographical memory, no narrative, you're in big trouble, basically. And that happens with people who have Korsakoff syndrome very specifically, but I'll say more about that as I kind of move through my talk in relation to other types of dementia, particularly Alzheimer's disease. So it's a good thing that we have these narratives, and we would want to remain them. We would want to kind of maintain them for all kinds of reasons. One final point that I want to make here is I'm just going to introduce this concept here from cognitive psychology. It's called the reminiscence bump. So it's a graph here at the bottom. So if you plot your age, basically, so the years of your life here, the horizontal x and then vertical x, the number of memories that you have, that you can remember, there is a bump here between age 15 and 25. There's a lot of memories that you can remember when you are, for example, say 50 or 60 and you're looking back at your past. It's called the reminiscence bump. And I think that can be explained by the fact that most of us will have many identity shaping experiences in that phase of our lives, right? So we graduate from high school, go to university, graduate from university, typically have our first job, leave our parental home, go on holiday with our parents for the first time, have our first romantic encounters. So a lot of stuff happens in that phase of our life that kind of shapes or cements our identity. And for that reason, it's important to remember that, right? Because those experiences kind of make you who you are. It's important for you to remember those experiences. And so I'll get back to this concept of a reminiscence bump later on in my presentation, by the way. All right, let me see here. I'm going to drag this. It's kind of in the way. Yeah, sorry. Okay, narrative identity. What exactly is that, right? There's a lot to say about what that is. I'm going to highlight 4 properties that I think are really kind of important for better understanding human narrative identity. Firstly, it is a dynamic depiction of a series of past experiences, typically remembered in chronological order. So you remember things in an order in which they happened. Mostly, not always. Sometimes you remember events in a way, in an order in which it didn't happen. That's just kind of a feature of biological memory. It isn't perfect, right? But I'll get back to that later as well. But dynamic here is kind of the key word, I think. And what I mean here with dynamic is that as you live your life, as you get older, you have more experiences. And in that sense, your narrative grows, right? So your narrative expands because you have more experiences. So it's dynamic in that sense. It's also dynamic in the sense that the memories, the building blocks of the narrative, decay and disappear and lose some of their detail over time as you get older, right? That's just a normal feature of getting older. So it expands in one way, but it gets thinner in another way. Now, these memories are chosen selectively. The narrative isn't like a film of my entire past. It is kind of fragmented. I don't remember everything I've ever done in my past. That would not be necessary. There's no storage capacity in the brain for that, and you don't need it. It doesn't have any function to remember your entire life in detail. So it's kind of fragmented. The stuff that is kind of emotionally or affectively salient are the things that you remember. Memories are records of subjective interpretations of experiences, right? So we all are subjects of experiences. We all have this unique first personal perspective on the world. And if it's important enough, if the experience is important enough, it's stored. It's interesting that it turns out that the deeper a memory is in your past, the more likely it is that you have a third personal perspective on yourself in the memory. So when I remember the Thai curry that I had yesterday, I can visualize it. I was sitting at the table, actually. The table is actually in a spot I can see. It was kind of yellow. It was very tasty. It was spicy. My wife was here with me. I remember the music that was kind of playing. It was all from my first personal perspective, as if I'm looking through my own eyes. But when I want to remember, when I, for example, learned to ride a bicycle, which is, I don't know, 35 years ago or something, I don't see my hands holding the handlebars. I see my body from kind of a third personal external perspective, which is weird because that's not how it happened. I didn't have an outer body experience when I was learning to ride my bicycle. But still, when a memory is older, you tend to remember it from a third personal perspective. It's kind of an interesting feature of memory. And then finally, this notion of employment from Paul Ricoeur, who says that the agency of the person has to create meaningful relationships between the building blocks of the narrative, right? Otherwise, if you don't implode, if you don't make a plot, I guess, of your life, of your past, you just have a bunch of disconnected memories, but that's not the case, right? We know that all these memories are kind of chronologically and causally and historically connected, and in the sense also that I know that I am the protagonist in all these memories, right? It is me who had the experience. And that's the kind of thing that ties it all together. Okay, kind of quickly summarizing, a self-narrative is a dynamic, selective, and subjective story with a number of emplotted experiences that characterize the person's identity, right? It's an important thing that we have one. They allow us to understand our past, that it allows us to understand that the past has led to the present. And it also, interestingly, allows us to project ourselves into the future. So Mr. Thompson, who doesn't have a narrative, also has trouble imagining him in future situations. So we kind of need our past, we need our narrative to project ourselves into the future as well. So it's really, it's important. That's kind of the point I want to make here. We need to have narratives. All right, so my computer is now having some problems. Hopefully I'll get to the next slide. So I can't. So I can. Why is this not? Okay. Well, anyway, sorry for that. Right. So that's all I'm going to say about narrative. I'm going to now move into the second part, where I'll say a couple of things about the building blocks of the narrative, namely the specific autobiographical memories. And on my particular view, and this will be clear if you've read the paper which this talk is based. I kind of use autobiographical memory as a higher level category, and I think episodic and semantic memories can be part of that. So first, episodic memory. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. This is memories that are typically very visual in nature, or auditory, or tactile. It's a very unique phenomenology. It's kind of like traveling back into the past and then re-experiencing an event. Semantic memory is propositional in content, in nature, typically linguistic. It's kind of knowledge that you know that something happens. Episodic memory is obviously very important for your narrative because it's about stuff that you've experienced, but semantic memory too. So, for example, I semantically remember that I graduated from high school in 1996. I don't actually remember the event, oddly enough, but I do remember that it took place, right? I know that it took place, but I can't get kind of to the phenomenology of it, but I still knew that it took place. And both these types of memories, episodic and semantic, are important because they are the building blocks of the narrative. Now, some of these memories are scaffolded. What that means is that we sometimes rely on external objects in our environments to help us remember. I refer to these as evocative objects. That's a concept from Sherry Turkle. She has this edited book from 2007. It's called Evocative Objects. It's a very good book. I recommend reading it. And these are, personal objects like, for example, souvenirs or a piece of clothing or furniture, a CD, a DVD, a book, a letter, a musical instrument, a work of art, etc. It could be anything, any kind of object can be evocative when, if you interact with it, it helps you to trigger or it helps you to construct some feature of your past, right? So my living room is full of stuff that reminds me of my past, my office as well, my garage. Everybody has this kind of idiosyncratic, very unique kind of set of evocative objects. Now, some of these are representational. It's kind of interesting, like a picture I took of a holiday I went to on Bali 5 years ago. The picture is a representation of that it is a picture of, right? Let's say beaches with palm trees or something. And because it has representational properties, it can help me reconstruct the memory. But I could also take a shell from the beach in Bali and bring that home, put it on my bookshelf here, for example, and use that as a memory aid. So I can look at the shell and then, oh, this is fun. I was on Bali. Oh, it was a great holiday, etc. Right? So, but a shell is not a representation, right? A shell is not like a picture, or it's not like language, or it's not a symbol. It doesn't kind of represent any kind of event, I guess. But still, because of the connection that we can learn between the shell and the experience, it can still become an evocative object for us. It's kind of difference in the informational properties of these objects here. All right, now the content and the way we feel about memories changes over time. All right, so I already said that earlier. So detail is lost every time a memory is retrieved. It is reconstructed and then restored with a slightly different content. So the process of remembering, of retrieving memories from the brain and then having the memory and then restoring them can sometimes slightly alter the content of the memory. And also memories get lost or detail is lost. That has to do, I think, with the kind of the connectionist nature of the biological memory trace. So memories are stored or retained, if you like, if you don't like the word store, in connectionist networks in the brain. Bonds of neurons connected to each other with axons and dendrites. And these connections have a certain strength or a certain weight to them. And that can change over time. And because the brain is a biological system, sometimes these strengths, the weights between the connections weakens. And when that happens, the content of the memory is lost. This is all pretty kind of standard stuff, but I do want to now make an important point, and it is because human biological memory is like that for kind of both cognitively healthy individuals, but certainly for people who are struggling with memory problems. It is malleable memory, it changes over time. And because of that, we need the informational stability provided by evocative objects to reliably remember our past, right? It just helps, it's kind of common sense, I guess, that if you want to remember your personal past, you can trust and rely on the information in your brain. But if you want to do a better job, I guess, more reliable, whatever better means here in this context, we can maybe talk about that later. It makes sense to rely on pictures, on descriptions, on little videos, on souvenirs, on maybe stories of other people to construct your past in a more detailed manner. Because information in the brain is fleeting, information in evocative objects is not fleeting or much less fleeting. And so that can help us, basically. So the point I want to make is that what typically happens, I think, is when we remember our personal past, we typically integrate information that is in the brain, right? That information that is stored in connectionist networks in the brain with information in an evocative object, such as, for example, a picture. So when I look at the videos or the pictures of Bali, a holiday that took place 5 years ago, what happens, I think, is that there's some information in my brain left still there, and I'm perceiving a picture, and what my brain does is it integrates information in the picture and in the brain into a fuller, more detailed memory. And when that happens, information that we use to remember our personal past is distributed across embodied agents like myself and other humans and evocative objects. So we would kind of want to cast our net wider or enlarge the unit of analysis here, not look just at what happens in the brain or in the embodied agent, but look at the interactions with the environment. Take evocative objects into the target of analysis here. All right, so I'm an extended mind theorist, as some of you might know. I haven't really said much about the extended mind up to this point, but I'm gonna kind of briefly present my take on the extended mind. So for those of you who aren't familiar, the extended mind is the idea that the mind isn't just stored or realized in the brain. It sometimes can include external artifacts, right? So the extended mind literature looks at calculators and Google Maps and kind of artifacts that kind of functionally help you perform a cognitive task. That's really interesting. I'm more interested in kind of personal memory, autobiographical memory. Extended mind literature doesn't really look at that. But those memories, right, so autobiographical memory, can be extended, I think. I think the extended mind applies to those memories, but only under certain conditions. So on my view, yes, memories, autobiographical memories can be extended or they can be distributed if the agent, the embodied agent, and the artifacts are kind of deeply integrated into each other. If they're not deeply integrated, they're not extended or not distributed. So for me, whether or not the autobiographical memories of the agent, of the cognitively healthy agent or the agent with Alzheimer's disease are extended depends on the 8 dimensions that you see on this slide. So the 8 dimensions, they are matters of degree. We think of them in terms of a spectrum. And it can range between kind of the extremes on that spectrum. So I'll just talk you through this now. So first is information flow, right? So when a person interacts with an evocative object, like a phone, for example, pictures on my phone, or other kinds of evocative objects, sometimes information flow is one way, right? So just to use an example, if I want to navigate from where I live here to Cologne, for example, I would have to rely on the street signs. I couldn't do it without that. I've never been there before, so I need to use traffic signs to get there, right? So I look at the sign, I use the information to navigate. This is one-way information flow from artifact to the agent. I can also make a shopping list where I first write down a number of items with pen on paper, right? I offload information on the environment, then go to the supermarket, get the list out of my pocket and use it to remember which items I want to buy, right? So information is offloaded by myself. Then I go to the supermarket and I consume the information again, right? It's two-way, 2 steps, offloading and intake. Information flow can be reciprocal. And this is where kind of these are the canonical cases of extended mind literature. So, but when information flow is reciprocal, there are, first of all, many cycles of informational offloading and intake. And each cycle depends on the outcome of the previous cycle. So when I make a calculation with pen and paper, for example, let's say 822 multiplied by 724, I can't do it in my head, unfortunately. I need to use pen and paper. And when I do that, I write down the symbols on paper. I multiply single digits every time I write down the outcome. And by doing that, it allows me to perform the calculation. But there's many cycles of offloading and intake. And so it's reciprocal here. Right? Accessibility is a bit easier. It's just about how easily accessible the artifact or the object is, right? So a library book in Cairo, Egypt is inaccessible because I'm here now, I'm not in Egypt. But for example, the pictures on my phone are very accessible because my phone is always charged and I always carry it with me. Durability is about how often we interact with the artifacts. Sometimes we do it once, right? If I have a paper map, for example, that I use once when I'm on a city trip, for example, I use it once, but Google Calendar, I use every day, multiple times a day for a decade, and I'll probably keep using it in the next decade as well. So I use it many, many, many times. Trust is important because when you read kind of external information, you typically tend to evaluate it consciously or subconsciously, and then you come to the conclusion this information is true or it's false. If it's false, you're not going to use the information at all. If it's true, you are more likely to use the information. So you need to trust it. Otherwise, the whole system doesn't get off the ground. Procedural transparency is important. This goes back to the phenomenologists of the previous century, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty. They have these examples of a carpenter using a hammer and a blind person using a cane. And for those people, the hammer and the cane are kind of absorbed in the body schema and are transparent, are felt like phenomenologically as transparent extensions of the human body. They don't really feel as though they're interacting with the hammer or with the cane. They feel like they're interacting with the environment mediated by the hammer or the cane. The cane kind of becomes part of their bodily repertoire. And that takes time, right? So the first time you pick up a hammer, it's opaque, it's non-transparent, but do it many times. And even I can make a hammer transparent, although I'm not very handy. I wouldn't be a good carpenter, but training will make it transparent. I think a similar kind of phenomenon happens with information. So some information is opaque. So when I read a symbol in Chinese or Mandarin or in Arabic or in Spanish, I don't understand it. It's not transparent to me. I don't speak those languages. I can't do anything with it. but a word or a sentence in Dutch or English are transparent to me because I understand those languages. So the first time when I had to learn Dutch, it wasn't opaque, but over time, I made the symbols transparent to me. Personalization is about changing the informational content of the object to streamline the task that you're doing. So remember the map, the paper map, for example, when I'm navigating Cologne. I could also highlight the route from my hotel to the university, for example. I can change, and by doing that, I change the informational nature and informational structure of the artifact. I personalize it. By doing that, I make it more easy to use for me. And then finally, autobiographical dependency. This is really important in this context, and that is the degree to which we depend on an object to be able to remember an experience. So when I want to remember the Thai curry I had yesterday, I don't have to look at the picture of it or the video of it. I just remember it because the information is still in my brain, right? Stuff that happened recently is still kind of vividly vividly stored in a detailed manner in my brain. But the holiday in Bali I mentioned before happened 5 years ago. As I said before, information kind of decays of biological memory traces. When I look at the pictures of the holiday, information I am able to reconstruct the memory, right? So when an event has happened deeper in the past, I need to rely more, I need to depend more on an artifact in order to be able to remember or reconstruct that memory, right? So the dependency on an artifact, sometimes it's zero because all the information is in the brain. Sometimes the dependency is very strong when an event has happened deeper in the past. Now, on my view, this is kind of a practical conceptual framework, I guess, that you can apply to specific situations, specific interactions between a person and an artifact. And if that agent artifact system scores high on these dimensions, the system is deeply integrated. If it doesn't score high on these dimensions, it's not deeply integrated. So the higher, and this is the take-home point here of this slide, the higher an agent artifact system ranks on these dimensions, the more likely it is that we're talking about an extended cognitive system. So that's kind of all that I wanted to say here on this slide. And I'm guessing the point here also, of course, is that this kind of happens frequently, right? So for me, and also for people who have various versions of memory problems, for example, when you have Alzheimer's, some of these artifacts rank high on this scale basically, and are then part of or constitutive of the memory. Now, one final concept I want to introduce here is a memory ecology. It's a slightly different concept than what I used in the paper. And a memory ecology is the total field of all evocative objects, but also transactive memory partners. I haven't said anything about transactive memory partners, but these are other people like your partner or your parents or a colleague or whatever that you can sometimes talk to, and in conversation you sometimes reminisce about the past and you jointly construct a memory together in perhaps a somewhat similar way as when you look at a picture, for example. So it's objects and humans that are part of this overall memory ecology. It's basically any environmental resource or artifact or a person that is involved in autobiographical remembering is part of the memory ecology. And I think we need to look at the entire ecology of humans, including people who have dementia. That's important, I think. All right, now moving into the third component of my talk here. So I'll say a few things about how dementia, and then specifically Alzheimer's disease, impacts on our narrative identity. So dementia, it's a cluster of neurological disorders, and Alzheimer's and vascular dementia make up 75% of cases. And then specifically Alzheimer's is the most common version of dementia. So I'm going to focus on Alzheimer's for that reason. And the way that the kind of specific profile of Alzheimer's disease is as follows. So as the disease progresses, patients first lose the capacity to form new episodic memories, right? So let's say you're diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. The first thing that you notice is that it becomes more difficult for you to form and to store and consolidate an episodic memory, right? That process is that mechanism in the brain is first attacked, I guess, for lack of a better word. It's called anterograde amnesia, by the way. Second thing that happens is that older episodic memories that you still have about things that happened deeper in the past are then also lost. That's called retrograde amnesia. And then the final step, unfortunately, here is that the semantic memories of the personal past are also lost. So in a way, kind of episodic memories are more vulnerable, I think, to Alzheimer's disease. Semantic memories are more stable, or they're more strongly consolidated. But at some point, if you have Alzheimer's disease, those also are gone. At some point, your entire past it has disappeared, basically. And so that's what happens. The building blocks of the narrative slowly disappear. And because of that, the narrative as well. So people with Alzheimer's disease in their final stage don't have a narrative identity anymore. It's somewhat like Mr. Thompson that I mentioned in the beginning, who has Korsakoff syndrome. Now, this is extremely unfortunate for anybody who has seen a person with Alzheimer's disease in their environment. It's very tragic to observe this. It's extremely frustrating to have it. And there's a kind of robust empirical research that shows that the erosion of memory and identity specifically reduces the well-being of dementia patients. So it's terrible, right? If you know that your past is slowly slipping away from you, it's extremely frustrating, makes you angry, depressed sometimes. So it's really horrible to have Alzheimer's disease. Okay, I'm gonna start this slide with a quote from Daniel Dennett, who points out, this is a quote from him from his 1996 book, Kinds of Minds. And he argues that when you take dementia patients out of their homes, is literally separating them from large parts of their minds, potentially just as devastating a development as undergoing brain surgery. What he claims here is basically that it's more or less an extended mind approach. I think he says that the self-structured homes or environments of dementia patients are kind of extended memories. And if you take an Alzheimer's patient or dementia patient out of his or her self-structured environment and put them kind of unexpectedly in a nursing home, you separate them from their memory quality, from their evocative objects. And that can be, I think, just as devastating as maybe removing memories from the brain, if that were possible, hypothetically, in somewhat a similar way as in that film Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, where a neuroscientist can kind of remove memories from the brain. He says that's similar or functionally similar as removing them from their environment. And I agree with Denetti. I think he's spot on. It's a very good point, I think. So if anything you want to take from this talk, it's that don't do this, right? Don't suddenly remove a patient with Alzheimer's disease from their house and put them in a nursing home, because that typically is a very tragic, that it kind of accelerates the cognitive decline significantly. It's a terrible thing to do. Don't do this. One final example here. This is Otto and his notebook. Anybody who's familiar with the extended mind literature knows Otto. Otto is a hypothetical example from an article written by Andy Clark and David Chalmers called The Extended Mind, which is kind of when the extended mind is put on the map. Otto has Alzheimer's disease, and he has a notebook. This paper was written in the 90s, so he still has a paper notebook where he writes down addresses and phone numbers and things to do and whatever that's important for him. And the idea here is that the notebook is his memory, right? It's kind of functionally equivalent to his biological memory. And because his biological memory is deteriorating, the notebook becomes part of Otto's memory system. And in a way, also becomes part of Otto. And one thing that I want to do here in this slide is arguing that these evocative objects, when they are properly extending memories, they obtain a particular moral status, right? So as Dennett says, right, it's kind of like removing people from or disconnecting them from their evocative objects is kind of like brain surgery of removing memories from the brain. That's not okay. That's not as morally completely unacceptable. I think these evocative objects have a particular moral status. So it will be a very different kind of thing to steal Otto's notebook compared to stealing his shoes, for example, because his shoes are replaceable. You can just buy a new pair for him. The notebook is not. If you'd steal the notebook, you would literally intervene in his mind. And that is terrible, that is unacceptable. And we ought to, I think, try to maintain the relations that people with Alzheimer's disease have to their evocative objects. That's why we shouldn't put them quite suddenly in a nursing home. We should try to maintain and allow them to cultivate relationships they have to their memory ecology. So this leads me to the last component of my talk, in which I'm going to answer or hint at answering this question: how to organize the memory ecology of dementia patients, specifically Alzheimer's patients, as to help them preserve their memory and narrative identity, right? So what can we do, I guess, as philosophers, but also as practitioners, as gerontologists, as cognitive scientists, to change or structure their memory ecologies to help them better remember their past and maintain their narrative identity? Well, here's one example, one technology. All the examples that I'm going to mention are taken from the literature, from different parts of the literature: human-computer interaction, cognitive psychology, regular psychology. It's nothing new. I'm not a designer. I'm not a technologist. I'm a philosopher. So I synthesize ideas. So none of this is designed by me, but they are kind of very helpful strategies or interventions, I think, to help preserve the narrative identity of people with Alzheimer's disease. First are sense cams. So there's a little device that you wear around your neck with a lanyard here, as you can see. It has a wide angle lens, and it has a light intensity sensor and GPS location sensors. So the idea is you wear this around your neck, and then if you would move to a different room or go outside, different light intensity, different GPS location, then the device takes a picture automatically. And so at the end of the day, you will have hundreds of pictures sometimes. Some of them are blurry. Some of them, you might have 10 pictures of the same thing. You need to edit it. But that process, that's kind of the point partly, looking at those pictures at the end of the day to edit them, to select the correct ones and delete the ones that are irrelevant, helps for a stronger consolidation of the contents of the memory in a biological memory trace. So you might remember that the first stages of Alzheimer's are that you will have trouble storing episodic memories, right? That's the first symptom, right? It's more difficult for you to make or form an episodic memory. It's called anterograde amnesia. But looking at pictures made by sense cams can help you still better store the memory. That's already a very positive thing, I think. It doesn't have to be sense cam images. I think it can probably be any type of picture, but sense cam images are helpful because, well, they're taken from this first personal perspective and this wide angle camera, and the process is automatic. You don't have to take the pictures, kind of done outside your agency. So it's helpful. Sense cam images can also trigger the retrieval of memories that are otherwise inaccessible, right? So sometimes, so memory processing has different phases: storing, retrieving, consolidating. Sometimes the memory is in the brain, right? It's there, you know it's there, but you can't get to it. You can't retrieve it. It's like the tip of the tongue phenomenon that you know it, but you can't kind of retrieve it into consciousness. Looking at a picture can sometimes get the memory into consciousness. It is the kind of trigger that you need in order to be able to have that memory. And in that way, it helps people deal with retrograde amnesia. So images are very powerful evocative objects, very helpful, I think, for people with Alzheimer's disease. So here I'm presenting research done, I think in Toronto, somewhere in Canada, where human-computer interaction researchers developed what they call a multimedia biography. This is it's essentially a video, a 60-minute video representing a person's life. But the video is built up with photos and home videos and documents and letters, music. It's typically narration from a caregiver. And that video is represented chronologically. So it starts with kind of the youth and childhood and adolescence, marriage, career, hobbies, right? So it's told linearly, chronologically. It has chapters, I guess, if you want to call them that. And making that multimedia program is very helpful. So the person, and this is about people who are kind of the middle stages of Alzheimer's disease, making the biography is helpful because the patient is involved in it. So the patient has to select photos and home videos and music and help put it all together. So that process is helpful already. But particularly watching that home video, like a week or a month or a year later, when you look at the multimedia biography, it helps them to remember their past in a way that wouldn't be otherwise possible. They really need the information in the multimedia biography, sorry, so mouthful, to be able to remember some parts of their past. And so now I'm going to read a quote that really kind of has been very important for me, actually, in the last couple of years. And so the researchers who did the research write that family members and the participants perceived the multimedia biography as a means for preserving the personhood of their loved one. And this is, you might remember the title of my paper in my talk, Preserving Narrative Identity for Dementia Patients. So they are talking about personhood. I'm not quite sure if that's the thing that gets preserved. I think it's the narrative identity. That's not important. I think they recognize that these multimedia biographies help preserve the memories and therefore the identity of the patient. And that's a very important thing to do, I think. All right, moving on. This is another example. This is done in Denmark, in Aarhus. The place is called the House of Memories. It's a museum that is decorated like an apartment or a house from the 1950s in Denmark. It is not open to the general public. It is only open for people who have Alzheimer's disease and earlier mid stages of Alzheimer's disease and live in Aarhus. It's basically people from the local nursing home. They go in, they're welcomed by this young lady who's dressed in traditional 1950s clothing in Denmark to kind of enhance historical authenticity. And then these people here are encouraged to interact with the chairs and the table, and they get like a Danish sandwich type thing. They get tea from a teacup from the 50s. They can turn on the radio, and they can kind of, they're motivated or encouraged to interact with these objects. And that helps them to remember parts of their past. And so you might remember that in the beginning of my talk, I mentioned this idea of a reminiscence bump, which is that you have the most memories of your past between age 15 and 25. These people will have had their reminiscence bump in the 1950s. So when they go to this House of Memories museum, they get all these memories back from their childhood. And that can be a good thing if you had a happy childhood. If you didn't have a happy childhood, it could also be a bad thing, right? So if you don't want to be remembered of the things that happened to you when you were between 15 and 25, this might not be a good thing. So it depends kind of on your specific experiences and your specific narrative. But overall, this is helpful. This allows people to remember things from their past that they otherwise wouldn't be able to remember. All right, I'm almost at the end. Another example here. This is done in Germany, actually. This is from a town. It's called Krefeld. It's not even that far, I think, from Cologne. I'm not sure. It's South Germany. It's not that far from the Netherlands either. And what happened here is that human-computer interaction researchers redesigned the main street in Krefeld. So Krefeld is not a very big town, I don't think. And this is what that town looked like in the 1950s. So based on kind of historical photographs and historical archive, they redesigned it basically. And so this lady has this VR headset on, and she's walking through that main street as it looked like in the 1950s. And she also has had her reminiscence bump in the 1950s. So when she does this, she will remember things from her past that she otherwise wouldn't be able to remember, right? I think I might actually, for reasons of time, skip this final example. It's not super duper important. It's in a paper if you want to read it, but it's kind of more of the same, I think. I'm going over time a little bit, so I'm gonna conclude. So what have I done in the last 45 minutes? What is the kind of the point that I tried to get across? First, so recognizing the scaffolded or distributed nature of memory and narrative identity invites us to find treatments that focus on the environments in which dementia patients are situated, right? Trying to see, if you're an extended mind theorist and you recognize that memory and identity are kind of extended under certain conditions, if you think that's true, it's the kind of thing that motivates you. It's the kind of view or theory that motivates you to try to look for treatments in the environment. Don't look at the brain, look at the environment if you want to help people with Alzheimer's disease better remember their past. So rather than thinking of dementia as a disease that is only concerned with the brain, we should also recognize that dementia is concerned with the relation these patients have to their environment, right? So the context, the situation can be beneficial, is important, can be a good intervention for people who have various versions of dementia to better help them remember their personal past. So that is the main point that I want to get across. Thank you very much for your attention.